This is Sasha. This is Sam. When they first met, it was just small talk about where to find the best coffee, the new high top she just bought, a book of poetry he found at a used bookstore, a new local band she discovered just last weekend, a zombie apocalypse movie he saw last night with some friends from his martial arts class, her homemade screen print t-shirt, and his favorite Chinese restaurant, which made them both hungry. So they got 2 orders of Mandarin chicken with brown rice. And then Sam opened his fortune cookie. Life's journey ends with a new beginning.
Whoa, that's deep. But in the real world, life's journey ends with an ending. When you die, you're done.
Well, yes, your body no longer works, but your soul continues to exist, don't you think?
Your soul? No, I don't believe in ghosts. We're physical creatures, material objects, just a collection of highly organized atoms. When your brain flatlines, that's it. Game over.
So you don't believe in life after death?
No. I mean, it's a comforting thought, but there's just no scientific evidence for it.
Because the people who were not Christian, were not followers of Jesus, the moment they believed him to be risen, they became followers of Jesus, like Paul. And so if you're going to cut out everyone like that's testimony, that's everyone who has one position, even though they're coming from all these different backgrounds. So that's the first thing I would say. It's not quite a fair way to treat the evidence. But there is plenty of evidence outside of the New Testament. For more on this, go to the work of Gary Habermas. He has a book called Historical Jesus. I believe it's free on his website, garyhabermas.com. But he lists all the extra-biblical records of Jesus in the New Testament. Outside of the New Testament. So, for example, Pliny the Elder, right? Pliny's writing a letter to Trajan. It's in book 10 of his epistles, and as he's writing a letter to them, he says to Trajan, basically he says, look, I've got all these Christians. I've been asking them what they do, and they just tell me that they're trying to be good and helping people, but I don't believe them, so I've been killing them. Emperor Trajan, tell me how I'm supposed to do this. Should I be seeking them out and killing them? Or should I wait till they come to me? Maybe someone brings them to me. What should I do? In the process of writing this letter, he says that Jesus is worshipped as a god very early on. In other letters, we see things, for example, Lucian of Samosata, we see that in the Talmud, which is a Jewish source, we see in Mara bar Serapion, we see in Tacitus. These are all non-Christian, non-New Testament sources. All of them say Jesus was killed by crucifixion. So that is why scholars like Bart Ehrman, who I mentioned before, like Paula Fredrickson, like Marcus Borg, who I believe recently passed away, all these scholars who are non-Christian can say we can be certain that Jesus Christ died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Paula Fredrickson even says that this is one of the most certain facts of history. Not just as certain regarding Jesus, it's one of the most certain facts of history because these records are so widespread from so many different people. Not just Christians in the first generation in the New Testament, also Christians outside of the New Testament from the first generation. So read a letter like 1 Clement, which is Christian but not in the New Testament. From people who are Gentiles, like Tacitus and Lucian. From people who are Jews, like the Talmud and Mara bar Serapion. You've got a lot of this stuff everywhere. But I would be very remiss if I said that you can just toss out the New Testament. It's really not the right way to do history.
Want to go for a ride? Imagine an underground world made of concrete and steel, stairways and tunnels. Just enough light to see the signs on the walls. Suppose there were people who lived down here all their lives and were never allowed to visit the surface, and that these people were told from the time they were born that this world is all that exists. Wouldn't they believe what they're told to believe? Wouldn't they try to live like it's true? Suddenly a madman stumbles down the stairs and says to the people living here, "Don't you realize that you're underground? Don't you know that there's an amazing world right up those stairs and that a tomb no matter how spacious, is still a tomb. But the people laugh at the man. They say, "We understand our world just fine without all your rambling about another. Go back to your flying spaghetti world, fool. We're the enlightened ones down here." And in rejecting the world above, they sink a little deeper into the world below.
Scientists don't believe in God.
Well, I think you're overstating it a little bit. I think that most scientists don't think enough about God to know whether they believe in him or not. It's just irrelevant. There's no evidence that we need anything other than the laws of physics and the other laws of science to explain everything we see. Physics has been so successful in describing the universe that we tend to be the most obnoxious among the scientists in terms of our chutzpah, in terms of assuming what we can do. In fact, often overstating the case that science is all there is.
Why do you say overstating the case?
Well, because I've come to realize over the last years that it's really important to realize that science isn't all there is. We now can address with a straight face questions like, why is there matter in the universe, and what happened in the first billionth of a second. And so because of that grand sense of power, I think people tend to say, well, if we can understand things all the way back to the first billionth of a second, we understand everything. But science is not the only way of knowing. Many people feel some spiritual sense, and science doesn't address that. Some scientists would say because science doesn't address it, it doesn't exist. It's nonsense, you're fooling yourself. And that might be right. But if you can't test it, it isn't science. And there are lots of things you can't test. I think it is really important to recognize, as has been said, that science does not make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. And that's really important, because until you had science, everything was a miracle. So science takes a tremendous amount away from being miraculous. It says there's just a pedestrian cause, maybe a wonderful cause, but it's a natural cause. I was at the Vatican once and at the Pontifical Academy and lecturing to some theologians, and I said to them, and I wasn't being facetious, that they had to listen to me, but I didn't have to listen to them. Because in some sense, I think to have an honest and sensible theology, you have to be consistent with the laws of physics.
Right.
But I don't need to know anything about purpose or ultimate purpose of the universe to understand how it works.
But is there an area beyond which science cannot go, and even in principle cannot go?
Yes, of course, there is, and I would say faith in some sense. Faith being defined as that which you believe in with the absence of evidence. I'm always hesitant to make absolute statements, because as we understand more and more about the history of the universe and understand whether our universe is unique, etc., we may come to grips with questions that have traditionally been theological ones. So I can't say that at some point we won't, but it is important to realize at this point what the limits are. And I think there's been a lot of interest in the interface between science and religion, and I find that unusual. Because I don't think there is much at the interface.
There's like
At a time when it was believed that the earth sat on a large animal or on a giant, 1500 years before Christ, the Bible spoke of the earth's free float in space. He hangs the earth on nothing. Science didn't discover that the earth hangs on nothing until 1650, 3,000 years later. Encyclopedia Britannica documents that in 1845, a young doctor in Vienna named Dr. Agnes Semmelweis was horrified at the death rate of women who gave birth in hospitals. As many as 30% died after childbirth. Semmelweis noted that doctors would examine the bodies of patients who died, then, without washing their hands, they would go straight to the next ward and examine expectant mothers. This was their normal practice because the presence of microscopic diseases was unknown. Semmelweis insisted that doctors wash their hands before each examination. When they did that, the death rate immediately dropped down to 2%. Look now at the specific instructions the Bible gives to the Hebrew nation over 3,000 years ago when it comes to dealing with disease. And when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe his body in running water. Then he shall be clean. Nowadays, doctors wash their hands in running water. But it wasn't too long ago that they did so in a bowl of still water, leaving invisible germs on their hands. Leviticus 17 verse 11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement." Most of us don't think too much about the fact that a doctor can find out the health of our flesh by taking a sample of our blood. But the test can evaluate the health of our kidneys, our liver, thyroid, and heart. Among other things, the blood can reveal diseases and conditions such as cancer, AIDS, diabetes, anemia, and coronary heart disease. However, the great biological truth about blood revealing the health of our flesh wasn't fully comprehended until comparatively recent years. Up until 120 years ago, people were bled, and many died because of the practice. When George Washington became deathly sick, doctors thought that bloodletting would help him, but it didn't.
All told, his doctors took out about 80 ounces of blood over 12 hours, which is about 40% of an adult's blood volume.
Nowadays, we know that sick people need blood, so we give them transfusions. Rather than removing it, we replace it or replenish it, because blood gives life to the flesh. More than 1,000 years before Christ, the Bible stated this recently discovered biological truth: for the life of the flesh is in the blood. The scriptures tell us that the earth is round. Isaiah 40:22 says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth." The word translated circle is the Hebrew word chud, which is also translated circuit or compass, depending on the context. That is, it indicates something spherical, rounded, or arched, not something that's flat or square. The book of Isaiah was written sometime between 740 and 680 BC. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, theorized that the earth was round by watching the masts of ships sink down over the horizon, and from his studies of the moon during an eclipse. He noted that the shadow of the earth on the moon revealed that the earth was curved. He could have saved himself a lot of study if he had read the Bible, which stated that fact 300 years earlier. It was another 2,000 years later, at a time when many in science believed that the earth was flat, that the scriptures inspired Christopher Columbus to sail around the world. Matthew Maury is considered the father of oceanography. He noticed the expression, "the paths of the sea," in Psalm 8 verse 8, written 2,800 years ago, and he said, "If God said there are paths in the sea, I'm going to find them." Maury then took God at his word and went looking for these paths, and we are indebted to his discovery of the warm and cold continental currents. His book on oceanography remains a basic text on the subject and is still used in universities. In the book of Job, chapter 38, verse 35, God asked Job a very strange question back in 1500 BC. He asked, "Can you send out lightnings that they may go and say to you, 'Here we are'?" This says that light can be sent and then manifest itself in speech. But did you know that all electromagnetic radiation, from radio waves to X-rays, travels at the speed of light? This is why we can have instantaneous wireless communication with someone on the other side of the earth. The fact that light could be sent and then manifest itself in speech wasn't discovered by science until 1864, 3,300 years later, when British scientist James Clerk Maxwell suggested that electricity and light waves were two forms of the same thing. Genesis chapter 2 verse 1 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished." Everything is finished. Nature is complete. The brilliance of the light-giving sun is finished. The blue skies are finished. The clouds drop their rain, cleansing the air and giving life to the earth. The tall trees are finished, giving us oxygen to breathe. The rivers are finished, teeming with fish and filling our great oceans with water. The land is finished, yielding plants that give us food to eat. Nothing has a half-evolved eye or ear or leg or brain. It's all finished, from the animals to man to winged birds to the beauty and fragrance of a rose that blossoms to God's glory and for our pleasure. Nothing is evolving. Everything is finished, just as the Bible says. In Genesis chapter 6, God gave Noah the dimensions of the 1.5 million cubic foot ark he was to build. It's interesting to note that in 1993, a scientific study was conducted by the South Korean World-Class Ship Research Center, CRISCO. They compared 12 hulls of different shapes and discovered that no modern design outperformed the biblical model. The length of the ark was 6 times its width and 10 times its height. Many contemporary ships are built with similar proportions, although the length to breadth ratio is usually chosen with regard to the power required to move them through the water. The ark needed only to keep afloat. In Leviticus 13, verse 46, the Bible speaks of quarantine long before medical science discovered the importance of isolating those with infectious diseases. In 1490 BC, it gives instructions on what to do if someone has leprosy. He shall be unclean. All the days that he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Laws of quarantine were not instigated by modern man until the 17th century. The devastating Black Death of the 14th century took an estimated 70 million lives. This was because they failed to separate the sick from the healthy. When whole families fell ill, it was attributed to bad air. However, putting into practice the ordinances of quarantine laid out in Scripture would have saved millions of lives. In Job 40 verse 15, God himself speaks to Job of a creature he created called Behemoth. Some Bible commentators believe this creature is a hippopotamus, as does this particular commentator. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with you. He eats grass as an ox. Lo, his strength is at his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. He who made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. He lies under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinks up a river. He hastens not. He trusts that he can draw up Jordan unto his mouth. He takes it with his eyes. His nose pierces through sneers. Science can only speculate as to why the dinosaur disappeared, but the answer may be in this passage of Scripture. As we have seen, some commentators think this is a reference to the hippopotamus. However, one of the characteristics of this massive animal was that it had a tail that is likened to a cedar, which is a very large tree. Clearly, the hippopotamus doesn't qualify. Here are the characteristics of this animal. It was the largest of all the creatures that God had made. It was plant-eating, that is, herbivorous. It had its strength in its hips, and a tail like a large tree. It had very strong bones, lived among the trees, drank massive amounts of water, and was not disturbed by a raging river. The Bible then says, he that made him can make his sword approach unto him. It would seem that God had caused this, the largest of all the creatures he had made, to become extinct.
So here I am, a rapidly deteriorating atheist, sitting in a poorly lit cell, doing my Bible homework, getting straight A's. I haven't eaten in days, and I read about Jesus saying, I'm the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry. I'm obsessed with liberating myself from a society that has me trapped in a 6.5 by 8 foot cell. And I read, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I'm wondering how long my body can take what I'm doing to it before my heart stops and I read, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. Kind of creepy when a book talks to you, but what do I know? I used to think that cats were talking to me. Lying on my back, day after day, reflecting on life and theology and philosophy, three things started to destabilize my entire belief system. First, what's called the design argument finally hit me. I was looking at a wall and how the bricks were arranged, and I thought to myself, you know, if someone told me that these bricks went into this order by some process that didn't involve intelligence, I'd smack them in the mouth. And yet I believe that life formed without intelligence, when the most basic living cell is unimaginably more complicated than some bricks stacked on a wall. Why did I blindly accept the extraordinary claim that life arose spontaneously from non-life without demanding some very good evidence. Second, I found out how Jesus' apostles died. Most of them went to their bloody deaths claiming that they had seen him risen from the dead. My explanation for the origin of Christianity had always been that the apostles made up a story so that they could spread his message, but now my explanation wasn't making sense. If you're willing to die for something, you have to believe it. When a terrorist blows himself up, he's obviously sincere. So the disciples, the apostles, had to believe what they were dying for, but this means that they were convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. Now, usually when someone is willing to lay down their life for something, it's for an ideology that they got from someone else, and that ideology could be true or false. The disciples were dying for something that they saw. What could have convinced so many different people that they had all seen a resurrected man? I could explain one witness by saying he's crazy, but all of them? Something was going on here and I had to figure it out, but I couldn't come up with any explanation for why they had that level of confidence other than they actually saw him. Third, I started worrying that Jesus might actually be better than me. Now, if you're not a complete moral relativist or maybe one of the new atheists, it's probably obvious to you that Jesus is better than me. But I wasn't the clearest thinker on moral issues back then, so getting my mind around this was very difficult. Here's the problem that emerged. I had two beliefs that just didn't go together. On the one hand, I believe that human beings are lumps of cells, meaningless lumps of cells, and that everything we did was pointless. At the same time, I believe that I was the best, most important person in the entire world. How is it possible to be the best, most important, worthless lump of cells? If there were to be some sort of best person, that would require something like a standard of good, and that would require something like God, and then someone like Jesus would be better than me. So my beliefs were breaking down at the foundational level. And once the foundations start crumbling, everything starts coming down. I went from believing that I was the best person in the world to thinking that I was the worst person in the world. And in a moment of clarity, it all just hit me, thinking, I'm a guy who once choked my friend until bloody foam came out of his mouth. I hit him with a shovel because he disagreed with me. I don't even remember what it was about. I used to watch my mom's boyfriend beat her, and I wouldn't lift a finger to help her. Not because I was scared. I was 200 pounds and I had a gun. I could have stopped it at any time. I just didn't care. And I was proud of the fact that I didn't care. I thought about what I'd done to my family, what I was doing to myself. They brought me food every single day, and I was starving to death because I wouldn't eat it. There were other starving people in the world, but at least they could think straight. I sat there thinking about torturing people. My skin was turning yellow. I was scratching myself bloody. What sense did it make to think that I'm the best at anything? When I was thinking about that situation, I just thought, it feels like I've just been stomped relentlessly into the ground. And when I thought that, I started comparing it with a little hospital stay about 1.5 years earlier. I got into a fight with 7 guys. I'm not saying that to be tough. They won that one. I got one of them. He hit me with a gun, and I hit him with these guns. And then his 6 friends got on me and got me on the ground, and then took turns soccer kicking me in the head. But I was comparing that to the situation I was in. I was thinking, I was okay the next day. I had scratches on my neck. I was dizzy walking around. I had my arm in a sling, but I was okay. Fighting 7 guys is a joke compared to what I was going through in that cell. I feel like I've just been stomped into the ground, and when I thought that I felt like I'd been stomped into the ground, I had another flashback. One night I was walking home from a friend's house and a storm hit. There was rain was so bad I could barely see. Lightning was striking all over the place, and I looked up, and mockingly said, oh, is that supposed to scare me? If you want me to believe in you, better come down here and make me believe. I wasn't serious, but given my circumstances in the jail, I had to start wondering if God had taken it seriously. That normally wouldn't have been an option. I didn't think like that. But since my entire worldview was crumbling, I wasn't in a position to dismiss alternatives. But there's a problem. If there was a God involved in all of this, if right and wrong weren't merely useful fictions, I was in all kinds of trouble. Not just for what I had done, but for what I was. How is the worst person in the world going to ever do the right thing? There's no magic switch that I can flip and, oh, now I care about other people. So how was I going to do anything right? And then it hit me that there are two possibilities. Either I'm violent and selfish and uncaring, and that's just the way things are, or there's someone who can help people like me. Either I'm all messed up and that I just had to live with that, or there was someone who could deal with this sort of thing. And when you start thinking like that, I'd say you're about 2 inches away from becoming a Christian, because when we ask ourselves, who out of anyone ever, who had the ability to take psychologically, spiritually, and morally shattered people and give them new life, we get a list of one. You get a list of one. There's one person on the list. He's the one who said, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I didn't know if Jesus was who he claimed to be, but I knew that it was Jesus or nothing. It was Jesus or nothing. If anyone has God's stamp of approval, it's the guy who rose from the dead. History is filled with dead options. Jesus is the last living option. So I bowed down on my bunk, not sure of much of anything. And I prayed. I didn't know how to pray, but I prayed. And I said, God, I don't know if I'm going to believe in you tomorrow, but I believe in you right now. If you can do anything with me, you're welcome to it. And then I continued with a kind of sinner's prayer that I had read in those Bible studies. And when I sat up from that prayer, the entire world looked different. Like everything was a different color. For the first time in a lot of years, I didn't want to hurt anyone. And I had a strange sense that I'd somehow known the truth all along.